hands frozen, her heart hammering like a war drum, gripping $2,000 that don't belong to her. Money from the Mafia boss. Cassius Levine's money, a man whose very name makes criminals tremble. Marigold. His voice shatters the silence. He's there, standing in the shadows, seeing it all, the envelope clutched in her hands, the guilt carved into her face, the raw fear in her eyes. He moves closer, one step, another. She can't move, can't even breathe. What does a man like him do when he's been betrayed? What happens when he catches his employees stealing? What transpired in those next 30 seconds would define the rest of their lives. But first, he had to know why. And when he discovered her truth, nothing would ever be the same. Marigold's hands trembled as she stood in the hallway outside his office. The mansion was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant tick of an antique clock somewhere in the darkness. It was 2:47 a.m. She knew because she'd been watching the small clock on her phone for the past 20 minutes, waiting for her heart to stop racing, waiting for the courage that never seemed to come. The envelope sat on his desk. She'd seen it there when she'd come in earlier to empty the trash, the corner peeking out from under a leather-bound ledger. Cash. Always cash in this house. Bills that could disappear without anyone asking questions. Money that moved through rooms like water, present one moment and gone the next. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window. A woman in a simple gray uniform, hair pulled back tight, face pale under the soft glow of the desk lamp she'd switched on. She didn't look like a thief. She looked exhausted. She looked afraid. What she couldn't see in that reflection was the truth that lived beneath her skin, that she was a woman who'd been broken down piece by piece over 4 years, a mother who would do anything to protect her children, a survivor who'd learned that sometimes survival meant becoming someone you never thought you'd be. She took a step closer to the desk. Then another. The marble floor was cold under her shoes, despite the thick socks she wore to muffle her footsteps. Everything in this house was expensive. The floors, the furniture, the art on the walls, that probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years. And here she was, about to steal from the man who owned it all. And the envelope was heavier than she expected. Her fingers brushed against it, and she felt the thickness of the bills inside. How much? 500, 1,000. Enough to buy another week, maybe 2 if she was careful. Enough to keep him calm, to keep the threats at bay, to keep her babies safe. She picked it up. The weight of it settled in her palm like a stone, like evidence, like guilt made tangible. Her breathing was too loud in the quiet room. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Just take it, put it in your pocket. Walk away, come back tomorrow and clean like nothing happened, like you're still the same person you were yesterday. But she wasn't. She hadn't been that person for months now. Marigold. The voice came from behind her, soft and steady, and she felt her entire body freeze. Not from cold, but from pure, crystalline terror. The envelope slipped from her fingers and landed with a soft thud on the desk. She turned slowly, her mouth dry, her mind scrambling for excuses that wouldn't come. He stood in the doorway, tall, dressed in dark clothing that made him blend with the shadows, his face unreadable in the dim light. Cassius Levine, her employer, the man whose house she cleaned, whose meals she sometimes prepared, whose world she moved through like a ghost, unseen and unimportant. The man she had just tried to steal from. Cassius didn't move, didn't shout, didn't reach for his phone to call security. He just stood there, watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything, the kind of eyes that made people confess to crimes they hadn't even committed yet, eyes that had seen violence, had ordered violence. They had lived in a world where power was the only currency that mattered. But right now, those eyes held something else. Curiosity. And something that might have been concern. Marigold's voice cracked. It's late, he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. A voice that could order a man's death as easily as it could order dinner, but right now it carried no threat. Only observation. You should go home. That was it. No accusations, no threats, no demands for explanations. Just a simple statement, delivered in a tone that could have been discussing the weather. She nodded, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly. She moved toward the door, keeping her eyes down, expecting any second for his hand to shoot out and grab her arm, for security to appear. For the consequences she deserved to finally arrive. But he stepped aside, let her pass. The scent of expensive cologne and something else, cigarette smoke maybe, or the leather from his jacket, drifted past her as she slipped through the doorway and into the hall. She didn't run. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt, to race down the stairs and out the door and never come back. But she forced herself to walk at a normal pace, her legs shaking, her hands clenched at her sides. Behind her, she heard nothing, no footsteps, no calls to stop, nothing, and somehow that silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. He caught her stealing and didn't say a word. Cassius stood in his office long after Marigold had left, staring at the envelope she'd dropped. He'd known about the missing money for weeks. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there. Amounts that his accountant had flagged, but that he'd dismissed as unimportant. Money was meaningless to him in quantities that small. He made more in an hour than most people made in a month. But he'd been curious. Who was taking it? Why? And why always such small, careful amounts? So he'd watched, paid attention. And he'd noticed things about his housekeeper that he'd been too busy to see before. The way she sometimes winced when she lifted heavy objects. The faint discoloration on her wrist that looked like finger marks. The split lip she'd tried to hide with makeup 2 weeks ago. The way she flinched when he entered a room unexpectedly, as if expecting violence. Cassius had built his empire on understanding people, their weaknesses, their fears, their motivations. And Marigold was afraid. Not of him, which was interesting, of something else. Someone else. Tonight he'd decided to find out who. He pulled on a dark jacket and left the mansion through a side entrance, getting into an unmarked car he kept for occasions when he didn't want to be noticed. By the time he reached the staff parking lot, Marigold was sitting in her old Honda, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel. He followed her through the quiet streets of the city, keeping several cars back, using techniques he'd learned long ago, in a different life. She drove to an apartment building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Cracked pavement, flickering streetlights, the kind of place where people minded their own business because asking questions was dangerous. And he parked down the block and watched her walk toward the building. She stopped outside the entrance, her hand on the door, and he saw her take several deep breaths. Like she was gathering courage just to go home. That told him everything he needed to know. He waited until she disappeared inside, then drove slowly past the building, memorizing the address, the layout, the exits, the old habits. He'd stopped being a soldier years ago, but the instincts never left. Back in his mansion, in his office, Cassius sat in the darkness and thought about the woman who cleaned his house, who stole small amounts of cash and kept careful track because she planned to pay it back, who walked into her own home like she was walking into battle. He could ignore it, could fire her tomorrow and find another housekeeper, someone without complications. Oh, someone who didn't steal. That would be the smart business decision, but Cassius hadn't built his empire by always making the smart business decision. Sometimes you made the right decision instead. He picked up his phone and sent a text to her employee file number. 8 a.m. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited for morning. Marigold made it through the night, barely. Garrick, that's what she still called him in her mind, though his full name was Garrick Thorne, and he'd been her husband for 6 years, before becoming her nightmare. Had been waiting when she got home. Drunk enough to be mean, sober enough to be calculating. Well, I told you, tomorrow. You said that yesterday. He pushed himself up from the couch, not quite steady on his feet, the beer bottle in his hand sloshing. And the day before that. She'd tried to explain. Tried to keep her voice down so the kids wouldn't wake up. Tried to be the version of herself that could sometimes talk him down from his anger. But Garrick was past talking tonight. You know what happens if you can't get the money, right? His voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper that was worse than yelling. You know I need it. I owe people, Mari. Serious people. And if I don't pay them, I'll get it. When? Tomorrow, I swear. He'd studied her for a long moment, and she'd seen the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. Finally, he'd nodded and taken another drink from his bottle. Tomorrow, or next time, maybe I take one of the kids with me when I meet these people. He'd let them see what happens when promises get broken. The words had hit her like a physical blow. You wouldn't. Try me. He'd moved past her toward the bedroom, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath, the cigarette smoke in his clothes. Tomorrow, Mari. Don't make me ask again. Now, in the gray light of morning, Marigold got her children ready for school. Celine was 6, with her father's dark hair and her mother's careful eyes. Jasper was 4, still young enough to believe that everything would be okay because Mommy said so. She packed their lunches with the last of the bread and peanut butter, left notes in Celine's backpack, little reminders that she loved her, that she was proud of her. Garrick didn't wake up. He never did on mornings after drinking. She was grateful for small mercies. In after dropping the kids at school, kissing them both, holding them a moment too long, until Celine squirmed away with a giggle and Jasper complained about being late. Marigold drove to the mansion. The text from last night glowed on her phone. 8 a.m. She arrived at 7:55. Early, always early, because that's what good employees did. Even good employees who stole. Cassius was waiting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. He looked different in the morning light, less imposing, almost approachable, dressed in casual clothes that probably cost more than her car payment. But his eyes were the same. Watchful. Seeing everything. Marigold. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down. It wasn't a request. She set her bag on the counter and moved to the table, her legs unsteady, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their shaking. He pushed a cup of coffee toward her, black, the way she took it. He'd noticed. Of course he'd noticed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She stared at the coffee, at her reflection in its dark surface, at anything except his face. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. In that silence, Cassius made a decision. He could approach this a dozen different ways. Intimidation, threats, demands. That's what most men in his position would do. But Marigold wasn't most people, and this situation required something different. It required truth. How long? He finally asked. She knew what he meant. 3 months. Always cash from the office? She nodded. How much total? Maybe 6,000. Her voice was barely a whisper. I kept track. I was going to pay it back. I swear Why? The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught her off guard. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since sitting down. They weren't angry. They weren't cold. They were just curious, waiting. And Marigold, who'd been carrying this weight alone for so long, who was so tired of lying, who had nothing left to lose, told him the truth. I needed it. For what? To keep him calm, she heard herself say. To buy time. To keep my children safe. In the corner of the kitchen, where neither of them could see it, the morning light shifted slightly as clouds moved across the sun. A bird landed on the windowsill outside, pecked at something, flew away. The world continued turning while inside this kitchen, two people sat across from each other and negotiated the terms of survival. Cassius's expression didn't change. Your husband? Yes. He hurts you. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Sometimes. And the children? No. The word came out fierce, protective. Never. I would never let him. But he threatens to. She closed her eyes, nodded. Cassius had seen a lot of things in his life. Violence, betrayal, the thousand small cruelties that people inflicted on each other in the name of power, or profit, or simple meanness. But there was something about this, a woman stealing to protect her children from their own father, that touched something in him he'd thought was long dead. Empathy, recognition, the memory of his own mother, doing whatever she had to do to keep him safe from his father's fists. You should have asked me for help. Marigold almost laughed. It came out as something between a sob and a cough. Ask you? You're my employer. You're... She gestured vaguely at the mansion, at him, at everything. I can't just ask you to solve my problems. That's not how this works. How does it work? You pay me to clean your house. That's it. My personal life, my problems, those aren't your concern. And yet, here we are. He took a sip of his coffee, still watching her with that unreadable expression. With your personal problems very much my concern, because they led you to steal from me. I know. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting back tears. I'll pay you back, every penny. I don't know how, but I will. And I understand if you want me to leave, if you never want to see me again. I'll go right now. I followed you last night. Everything stopped. Her hands, her breathing, her heart. She lowered her hands slowly and stared at him. What Marigold couldn't know, what she couldn't see from across the table, was that Cassius was testing himself as much as he was testing her. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his capacity for compassion, because compassion was weakness in his world. Compassion got you killed. But here was this woman, this terrified mother, and all those walls were crumbling. After you left, he continued calmly, I followed you home. I wanted to see where you went, who you were going to, what was worth risking your job for. You followed me? I watched you walk up to your apartment. Watched you stop outside the door like you were gathering courage just to enter your own home. Watched the way you moved, like someone expecting violence. Heat flooded her cheeks, shame, hot and sharp. He'd seen everything. Her crumbling apartment, her broken down car, her pathetic life. I'm not gonna fire you, he said. She blinked, sure she'd misheard. What? I'm not going to fire you, and I'm not going to ask you to pay back the money. I don't understand. I'm going to help you. The words didn't make sense. She turned them over in her mind, trying to find the hidden meaning, the catch, the price. Men didn't help for free, especially not men like him. Why? She finally managed. Cassius considered the question. Why was he doing this? The easy answer was that he could. The true answer was more complicated. It involved his mother, dead now for 15 years. It involved the man who'd helped him escape his father's house when he was 17. It involved every person he'd failed to save, every time he'd chosen business over compassion. Every night he lay awake wondering if having all this power meant anything, if he never used it for something good. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, because you need help, because I can provide it, because sometimes the right thing to do is obvious, even in my line of work. I can't accept. You can. And you will. There was steel in his voice now, the kind of authority that made people obey without question. But first, I need to understand the full situation. Your husband, Garrick, I believe, what exactly does he do, besides drink and threaten you? How do you know I pay attention. He said it simply, like it was obvious. Like of course he knew the name of her abuser, the details of her life. Tell me. So she did. She told him everything about Garrick's gambling debts, the people he owed money to, the way he'd started asking her for more and more cash, about the nights he came home drunk and angry, about the threats that had evolved from vague to specific, from directed at her to directed at the children. She told him about the bruises she covered up, the lies she told at the kids' school, the fear that had become so constant, she didn't even notice it anymore. It was just the baseline of her existence. She told him how she'd started stealing, small amounts at first, money she found in coat pockets or left on counters, always from the rooms she was assigned to clean, always careful never to take so much it would be noticed. Then how it had escalated when Garrick's demands increased, how last night had been the first time she'd gone into his office, the first time she'd been desperate enough to cross that line. Cassius listened without interrupting. His coffee grew cold between his hands, but he didn't notice. He was too busy cataloging information, building a strategy, planning the moves that would dismantle Garrick's power piece by piece. Because that's what Cassius did. He dismantled things. He'd built his empire by understanding systems, how they worked, where their weak points were, how to apply pressure until they collapsed. He'd done it to rival organizations, to corrupt politicians, to anyone who stood in his way. Now he was going to do it to Garrick Thorne. When Marigold finished, the silence felt different, heavier. He threatened to take your children to meet the people he owes money to, Cassius finally said. Yes. When? Last night. If I don't bring money today, he said. She couldn't finish the sentence. Cassius set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but there was something in it that made Marigold's skin prickle with awareness. It was the voice of a man who'd ordered terrible things done, but right now it carried a different kind of promise. Protection, not punishment. That won't happen. You don't understand. Garrick, I understand perfectly. He leaned forward slightly. I understand that you're trapped in a situation you can't escape alone. I understand that you're protecting your children the only way you know how. And I understand that men who threaten children, any children, are the lowest form of life. There was something in his eyes now, something cold and calculating. It should have scared her. Instead, Marigold felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. What are you going to do? She asked. Nothing violent. He sat back. Nothing that will bring trouble to your door or put your children at risk. But I'm going to fix this, properly, legally, so that when it's over, you're protected. Your children are protected, and Garrick can never touch any of you again. I don't see how. You don't need to see how. You need to trust me. He stood up, moving to the counter to refill his coffee. Can you do that? Could she? Trust this man she barely knew, this powerful stranger who moved in circles she couldn't imagine, and who'd caught her stealing, and instead of punishment offered help. What choice did she have? Yes, she whispered. Good. He returned to the table. I need you to do exactly as I say. Can you do that too? She nodded. First, you're going to call Garrick. Tell him you have the money. Tell him you'll bring it tonight after work. But I'm giving it to you 2,000 in cash. That's what he asked for, yes? Yes, but no buts. You'll take it to him tonight. You'll give it to him exactly as you always do. You won't act differently. You won't say anything about our conversation. You'll be the same frightened woman you were yesterday. Can you do that? The thought of going back there, of facing Garrick, of playing this role one more time made her stomach turn. But she nodded again. Second, I need you to keep your phone on you at all times. If he threatens you, if anything happens that makes you feel unsafe, you text me immediately. I'll give you my private number. He pulled out his phone, and a moment later, hers buzzed in her pocket. She took it out with shaking hands and saw the new contact. Cassius. Third, starting tomorrow, you're going to keep a record. Every time he asks for money, every time he makes a threat, every time he does anything that makes you afraid, well, you're going to write it down. Times, dates, exact words if you can remember them. Everything. Why? Because we're going to build a case, a proper case that will stand up in court, that will get you a restraining order, that will protect your children legally and permanently. Garrick won't just accept. He won't have a choice. Cassius's voice was flat, final. I'm not going to kill him, Marigold. I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to do something far more effective. I'm going to make sure the law does its job. And if the law needs a little encouragement to do that job properly, then I have resources that can provide that encouragement. She stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're going to use your connections to ensure justice is served. Yes, he met her eyes. Is that acceptable to you? Was it? Was she comfortable with a man like Cassius Levine using his influence to help her? With accepting money from him, protection from him, intervention from him? She thought about Celine's smile, about Jasper's laugh, then about the way they shouldn't have to live in fear, shouldn't have to walk on eggshells around their own father, shouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of violence. Yes, she said. It's acceptable. Then we're agreed. He stood up, and she did too, automatically. The money is in an envelope in the office, same desk where you found it last night. Take it before you leave today. Give it to Garrick tonight. Tomorrow you come back here and we continue with the plan. Mr. Levine. Cassius, he said. If we're going to do this, you can call me Cassius. Cassius. The name felt strange in her mouth, too familiar, too intimate. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to take time, weeks, maybe months, and it won't be easy. You're going to have to be strong. Stronger than you've ever been. I can do that. He studied her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. What Marigold couldn't see, what she couldn't know, was that Cassius was seeing her differently now, not as his housekeeper, not as a problem to solve, but as someone worthy of protection, someone who reminded him of why he'd fought so hard to escape his own past. I believe you can, he said. The rest of the day felt surreal to Marigold. She drove home with the envelope hidden in her bag, hyper-aware of every car around her, every person she passed, convinced somehow that Garrick would know, would sense the change, would see through whatever mask she tried to wear. But when she picked up the kids from school, everything was normal. Celine chattered about her art project. Jasper showed her a bruise on his knee from falling at recess. They stopped at the park on the way home, and she pushed them on the swings, while the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, golden and warm. For those 30 minutes, she could almost pretend they were a normal family. That their father wasn't a man who threatened them. That their mother wasn't planning to take money from someone like Cassius Levine to buy their safety. Garrick was home when they arrived, sitting in front of the television with an open beer, watching some sports game with the sound too loud. He barely glanced up when they came in. Kids, go do your homework, Marigold said quietly. They scurried to their room without argument. They'd learned to read the atmosphere, to know when to make themselves scarce. Once she waited until their door closed before she pulled the envelope from her bag and set it on the coffee table in front of Garrick. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it, picked it up, counted the bills quickly, efficiently. It's all there, she said. He stuffed the money in his pocket and went back to his beer. See? That wasn't so hard. She wanted to scream at him. Wanted to ask him how he could threaten his own children, how he could drink away their rent money, how he could look at himself in the mirror. But she didn't. She just stood there, playing her part, being the frightened woman he expected. What Garrick didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that his wife had just made a deal with someone more dangerous than the men he owed money to. Someone who moved in silence, who planned in the shadows, and who would dismantle his life with the same cold precision he brought to every business transaction. The countdown had begun. Garrick just didn't know it yet. 3 weeks later, Cassius sat in his office with a thin folder and an expression that his business associates would have recognized as satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came from a plan executed perfectly. When Marigold arrived that morning, he was waiting with coffee, same routine they'd developed, same table, but today was different. Sit down, he said. She sat, and he slid the folder across to her. This is a temporary restraining order, he said. Approved as of this morning. Garrick isn't allowed within 500 feet of you, or the children. Marigold stared at the papers, the official seals, the legal language she barely understood. How did you... Your documentation was excellent, very detailed, very credible. Combined with the evidence we collected, the photos of bruises, the threatening text messages, the witness statements from your neighbors who've heard the arguments, it was enough for a judge to issue emergency protection. Witness statements? I didn't talk to my neighbors about... I did. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Discreetly, through intermediaries. They were surprisingly willing to help once they understood the situation. Of course, he had people who could do that. People who could knock on doors and ask questions and gather evidence without raising suspicion. Marigold should have been disturbed by the reach of his influence. Instead, she felt tears prickling at her eyes. In his office on the other side of the city, Cassius's lawyer, Maren Voss, a woman who'd built her career defending the indefensible and occasionally prosecuting them when the price was right, reviewed her notes one more time. The Thorne case had been almost too easy. Men like Garrick always left trails. They were too arrogant, too convinced of their own invincibility to cover their tracks properly. She'd seen Cassius do this before, seen him use his considerable resources to help people who had nowhere else to turn. It was his penance, she supposed, his way of balancing the scales for all the terrible things he'd done to build his empire. Back in the mansion kitchen, Marigold was trying to understand the reality of what this meant. "This means Garrick has to leave the apartment?" she asked. "It means he has to leave, yes. And the police will serve him with the order today at 3 p.m. They'll escort him from the premises and ensure he takes only his personal belongings. You and the children will be there. I'll be there too if you want me to be. And when it's done, the apartment is yours. He can't come back. But he'll fight this. Let him fight." Cassius's voice was calm, certain. "We have evidence. We have documentation. We have a clear pattern of threats and intimidation. And we have something else." He pulled out another paper from the folder. This one looked like a financial statement, covered in numbers and official stamps. "Garrick's gambling debts," Cassius explained. "It turns out he owes money to several very unsavory people, people who've been looking for him. People who are not protected by the law because they operate outside it." Marigold frowned, trying to understand. "I don't see how that helps." "I made a deal with them. They get half of what Garrick owes them, paid in full immediately, in exchange for their cooperation in providing evidence of his illegal gambling, his debt, his associations with criminal elements, all of which strengthens your case for the restraining order and, eventually, for full custody of the children. You paid his debts? Half of them. The other half he'll have to figure out on his own. But here's the thing. Those people I made the deal with, they're not going to be patient about collecting the remainder, which means Garrick is going to be very busy, very stressed, and very motivated to stay far away from you and focus on his own survival." What Cassius didn't say, what he kept to himself, was that he'd also made it clear to those debt collectors that Marigold and her children were under his protection, that anyone who threatened them would answer to him personally, that there were lines that couldn't be crossed. It was the kind of message that didn't need to be spelled out. People in that world understood. They knew who Cassius Levine was. They knew what happened to people who crossed him. Marigold would never know about that conversation. She didn't need to. All she needed to know was that she was safe. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." Cassius stood up, straightening his jacket. "You just have to be ready at 3 p.m. I'll pick you up at 2:30. We'll go together, and we'll make sure this is done properly." "Why are you doing this?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Really? Why?" He paused in the doorway, his back to her, silent for a long moment. In that silence, Cassius thought about his mother. About the night his father had broken her ribs, and she'd still gotten up the next morning to make breakfast, to smile at Cassius, to pretend everything was fine. About how she died still protecting him, still keeping secrets, still believing that somehow she could make it all work out. He thought about the man who'd helped him escape, a restaurant owner who'd seen the bruises, who'd offered him a job and a place to stay, who'd asked no questions and expected nothing in return, who'd saved his life simply because it was the right thing to do. He thought about all the people he'd failed since then. All the times he'd chosen money over morality, power over compassion, success over simple human kindness. "Because someone helped me once," he finally said, turning to look at her, "when I was in a situation I couldn't escape alone. Because I have the power to fix this, and I would be a coward not to use that power. And because you deserve better than a life lived in fear." Then he was gone, leaving Marigold sitting at the table with legal papers that felt like weapons, like shields, like the first real protection she'd ever had. At 2:30 p.m., Cassius's car pulled up outside Marigold's building. Not one of his flashy vehicles, a simple black sedan, unremarkable, the kind that wouldn't draw attention. He got out to open her door, and she climbed in with Celine and Jasper, who were wide-eyed and silent in the back seat, sensing the importance of the moment without understanding it. "Are we in trouble?" Celine whispered to her mother. No, baby, everything's going to be okay. The police were already at the apartment when they arrived, two officers standing in the hallway, professional and calm. Cassius stayed close to Marigold, not touching her, just present, a solid, reassuring presence at her back. Garrick opened the door looking confused, then angry when he saw the officers. What's this about? Mr. Thorne, one officer said. We need to speak with you about a restraining order that's been issued. Marigold watched his face change as they explained. Confusion, to disbelief, to rage. He looked past the officers at her, and she saw the moment he understood. You bitch, he hissed. You actually... Mr. Thorne, please calm down. The officer stepped between them. You need to gather your belongings and vacate the premises. You have 30 minutes. This is my home. You can't just... Sir, we can and we are. You can comply voluntarily, or we can arrest you for violation of the order. Your choice. Garrick looked at Marigold again, and she saw murder in his eyes. But he also saw Cassius standing behind her, saw something in Cassius's face that made him pause, made him think twice about whatever he'd been planning to say or do, because Cassius wasn't making threats. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, expression neutral, and somehow that was more intimidating than any display of aggression could have been. As he looked like a man who could end someone's life with a phone call and then go have lunch without losing his appetite. Garrick turned and stalked into the apartment. The officers followed, ensuring he only took what was his, ensuring he didn't damage anything, or try to intimidate Marigold further. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes for 6 years of marriage to be packed into 2 duffel bags and a garbage bag. 20 minutes for the father of Marigold's children to be escorted out of their lives. When the door closed behind him and the officers, the silence was deafening. Celine and Jasper stood in the living room, looking around like they were seeing it for the first time. Maybe they were. Maybe this apartment, without the constant threat of their father's anger, was a new place entirely. Is Daddy coming back? Jasper asked quietly. Not for a while, honey. Is that okay? Celine's voice was small. Marigold knelt down, pulling them both close. Yes, baby. That's very okay. Cassius stayed by the door, giving them space, but when Marigold looked up at him over the children's heads, he nodded once. A simple gesture that said, you did it. You're safe now. What Marigold couldn't see, what she couldn't know, was how much this moment meant to Cassius. How it felt like redemption, in a way that all his money and power never had. How watching this woman, finally free from fear, made something in his chest feel warm and light and terrifying. He'd saved someone. Really saved them. Not with violence, not with intimidation, but with strategy and resources, and the simple decision to help. It felt good. On better than any business deal he'd ever closed. I should get back, he said softly. Unless you need... We're okay. Marigold stood up, still holding the kids' hands. Thank you for everything. This isn't over yet, he reminded her. There's still the custody hearing, the final restraining order, making sure he stays away. But the hard part, getting you out of immediate danger, that's done. I don't know how I'll ever repay. You already have. He moved toward the door. By trusting me, by being brave enough to accept help. That's payment enough. The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Mar and Voss prepared Marigold thoroughly. They went over every detail of the documentation, practiced potential questions, discussed strategy. The judge will ask about your financial situation, Marin explained during one of their prep sessions. Garrick's lawyer will try to argue that you can't support the children alone. But I have a job. I know, but we need to be prepared for the argument. Can you show stable income, stable housing, a support system? Marigold thought about the apartment she couldn't afford on her own, the job that didn't pay enough, the lack of family, or friends who could help. I'll figure it out, she said. Cassius, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner of his office during the meeting, spoke up. She has stable housing. I own the building her apartment is in. I can adjust the rent to something manageable. Marigold stared at him. You what? I bought it 2 weeks ago, from the previous landlord. Market rate transaction. Nothing unusual. As the new owner, I'm entitled to set rent at whatever I deem appropriate. For a long-time, reliable tenant like yourself, a reduction is perfectly reasonable. You bought my entire apartment building? It was a good investment. He said it so casually, like people bought buildings every day. In his world, they did. Marin continued as if nothing unusual had happened. She'd worked with Cassius long enough to not be surprised by his methods. Excellent. That strengthens the stability argument. Now, about character witnesses. The conversation moved on, but Marigold couldn't stop staring at Cassius. He'd bought her building, not to trap her, not to hold it over her head, but simply to ensure she could stay there, could afford it, could provide a stable home for her children. Who did that? And who went to those lengths for someone they barely knew? After the meeting, when Moran had left and Marigold was gathering her things, she finally asked, "The building, did you really buy it for investment, or did you buy it for me?" He looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I need to understand what this is." She gestured between them. "What we're doing, why you're doing it." "I told you why. You told me someone helped you once, that you believe in using your power to protect people. But this is more than that. This is going far beyond what anyone would reasonably do for an employee." He set down his papers and leaned back in his chair, studying her with that intense focus that always made her feel seen in ways that were both comforting and terrifying. Yeah, you're right," he finally said. "This is more than I would typically do." "So why?" "Because I see myself in your situation." The words came out carefully, like he was testing their weight. "Not exactly. My circumstances were different. My challenges were different. But the feeling of being trapped, of doing things you never thought you'd do just to survive, of protecting people you love at the cost of your own dignity, I understand that. I lived that." "You?" A small bitter smile crossed his face. "You think I was born into this?" He gestured at the mansion, the expensive furniture, the life of luxury. "I wasn't. I came from nothing. Worse than nothing, I did things I'm not proud of. Things I can't undo. Things that still haunt me. But someone saw potential in me. Saw that I was worth saving, and they helped me become something more than what my circumstances dictated. And now you're paying it forward." "Something like that." He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens. "I can't undo my past, Marigold. I can't make the world a better place in any grand, sweeping way, but I can help individuals. One at a time. I can use the power and resources I've accumulated to fix problems that the system doesn't care about. And when I see someone like you, strong, determined, fighting for your children despite impossible odds, I see someone worth fighting for." Marigold felt her throat tighten. "I'm not that special." "You're more special than you know." He turned back to face her. "You could have given up. You could have become bitter and hard and cruel. Instead, you steal money to protect your children. Why, you show up for work even when you're exhausted and afraid. You smile at them and make them spaghetti and push them on swings. You're a good mother, Marigold. A good person. That's worth protecting." She didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to process the warmth in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was something precious instead of a burden. What she didn't know, what Cassius would never tell her, was that helping her had become more than just a good deed. It had become personal. She'd reminded him of who he used to be, of the better version of himself he'd abandoned somewhere along the way to building his empire. Helping her felt like helping himself, like maybe he could still be more than just the sum of his worst decisions. "Thank you," she finally whispered, "for seeing me, and for helping me, for everything." "You don't have to thank me. Just keep being who you are. Keep fighting for them. That's enough." The custody hearing went better than Marigold dared hope. Garrick's lawyer tried to argue that she was unstable, that she couldn't support the children, that the restraining order was based on exaggerated claims. But Marin had evidence. Pages and pages of documentation, photos of bruises, threatening text messages, neighbor testimonies, financial records showing Garrick's gambling and drinking. The judge listened to it all with a stern expression, asked pointed questions, and finally ruled in Marigold's favor. Full custody. Supervised visitation for Garrick only if he completed anger management and substance abuse programs. Child support payments enforced through the court. Marigold walked out of that courthouse feeling like she could breathe for the first time in years. Cassius was waiting outside, leaning against his car, wearing sunglasses that made him look like something out of a movie. He straightened when he saw her, and she didn't think. She just walked straight to him and hugged him. He stiffened for a moment, surprised. Physical affection wasn't something he was accustomed to, wasn't something he allowed in his carefully controlled life. But then his arms came around her, carefully, gently, like he was afraid she might break. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You're welcome." His voice was soft, rumbling through his chest where her ear was pressed. "You did the hard part. I just helped clear the path." She pulled back, wiping at her eyes, laughing a little at how emotional she was being. "Sorry, I'm not usually this." "Don't apologize, you earned this moment. Feel it." So she did. She stood there in the courthouse parking lot and felt the victory, the relief, the sheer weight of fear that had been lifted off her shoulders. She felt free, and Cassius stood beside her, watching her smile, watching her cry, watching her finally allow herself to feel safe. And something in him shifted, something he'd kept locked away for 20 years, something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. He cared about her, really cared, not as a project, not as penance, but as a person. That should have scared him. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd felt in years. Life didn't immediately become perfect after that. Money was still tight, and the kids still asked about their father sometimes. There were nights Marigold lay awake worrying about the future, but it was a different kind of worry. Not the immediate, visceral fear of violence, but the normal concerns of any single parent trying to make ends meet. She kept working at the mansion. Cassius never treated her differently. She was still his housekeeper, still addressed as Marigold, still expected to do her job well. But there were small changes. A Christmas bonus that was more generous than necessary. A flexible schedule when one of the kids was sick. The occasional envelope left on the kitchen counter with, "For Celine's birthday," or "Jasper's school supplies" written on it in his precise handwriting. She tried to refuse these gifts at first, tried to maintain proper boundaries between employer and employee. But he'd just give her that look, the one that said he'd already made up his mind and arguing was pointless, and she'd find herself accepting because what else could she do? 6 months after the custody hearing, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Marigold was cleaning the library when Cassius appeared in the doorway. "Marigold, do you have a moment?" She set down her duster. "Of course." He led her to his office and gestured for her to sit. This time there was no coffee, no casual conversation. He looked serious, and her stomach clenched with worry. "I have a business opportunity," he said, "and I wanted to discuss it with you first before making any decisions." "Okay?" "I'm expanding my real estate portfolio. There's a property I'm interested in, a small apartment building about 20 minutes from here. It needs significant renovation, but the location is good. The structure is sound. I'm considering buying it, fixing it up, and renting it out." She nodded, not sure why he was telling her this. "I need someone to manage it," he continued. "Someone trustworthy, someone organized, someone who understands what tenants need because they've been a tenant themselves. Someone who could handle maintenance requests, collect rent, deal with contractors, maintain the property." Understanding started to dawn. "You want me to? I'm offering you a job. Property manager, salaried position with benefits, including health insurance for you and the children. Hours would be mostly flexible. You'd need to be available for emergencies, but otherwise you could work from home, set your own schedule, be there for Celine and Jasper when they need you." Marigold stared at him, and her mind racing. "I don't know anything about property management." "You can learn. I'll provide training, resources, support." And you'll still have this job as a backup if it doesn't work out, though I think it will. You're capable, Marigold, more capable than you give yourself credit for. Why would you offer me this? Cassius had anticipated this question. He'd spent the past 2 weeks convincing himself that this was purely a business decision, that he needed a property manager he could trust, and Marigold had proven herself trustworthy, even when she was stealing from him. That it made logical sense to offer this opportunity to someone he knew, someone he'd seen work hard despite impossible circumstances. But the truth he barely admitted to himself, was that he wanted to see her thrive, wanted to give her opportunities she'd never had, wanted to be part of her success in a way that felt more meaningful than just writing checks. Because you need a better job, and I need someone I can trust, he said, sticking to the safer truth. Because you've proven yourself reliable and honest. Even when you were stealing from me, you kept track because you planned to pay it back. That's integrity. That's what I need in someone managing my properties. And if I say no, then nothing changes. You keep cleaning, I keep paying you. We maintain our current arrangement. But I hope you'll say yes. She thought about it. Thought about the stability of a salaried position, the health insurance she desperately needed, the flexible hours that would let her be a better mother. One thought about the risk of accepting even more from this man who'd already given her so much. I need some time to think about it. Take all the time you need. He stood up, signaling the conversation was over. But Marigold, you deserve this opportunity. Don't let fear or false humility make you turn it down. Marigold talked to Marin about it. The lawyer had become something of a friend over the months of legal preparation. She listened to Marigold's concerns, her worries about owing Cassius too much, about crossing lines she couldn't uncross. He's offering you a legitimate job, Marin pointed out, at market rate salary, with appropriate benefits. There's nothing inappropriate about accepting a job offer from someone who's impressed with your work ethic. But it feels like more than that. Because it is more than that, Marin smiled. He's invested in your success. That doesn't make it inappropriate. It makes it fortunate. How many people have employers who actually care about their well-being? I don't want to be charity. This isn't charity. He needs a property manager. You need a better job. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. And honestly, Marigold, after everything you've been through, after how hard you've fought for your children, don't you think you deserve a break? Don't you think you deserve someone offering you a hand up instead of a hand out? Maybe she did. Maybe she'd been so focused on maintaining her independence, on not being a burden, that she'd forgotten how to accept help. When it was offered genuinely, she took the job. The training was intense, but manageable. Cassius paired her with an experienced property manager named Tempest, who showed her the ropes, how to screen tenants, handle maintenance requests, keep financial records, deal with contractors. She learned about building codes and lease agreements and tenant rights. She made mistakes, but Cassius was patient, treating each error as a learning opportunity rather than a failure. The building itself was beautiful once the renovations were complete. 12 units, mostly 1 and 2 bedrooms, updated kitchens and bathrooms, a small courtyard garden that Marigold helped design. They filled it with families and young professionals, people who reminded her of herself a year ago, working hard, trying to make ends meet, and deserving of a safe, affordable place to live. She was good at it, better than she expected. She liked helping people find homes, liked solving problems, liked the feeling of managing something important. The salary was enough that she could save money for the first time in her life. Enough that she could take the kids to dinner sometimes, or buy them new clothes without panicking about the cost. Life got better. Not perfect, but better. And that was enough. 2 years after that morning when Cassius caught Marigold stealing, they had their annual property review meeting. She sat in his office with her reports and budget proposals, professional and prepared, proud of what she'd accomplished. He reviewed everything carefully, asked questions, made suggestions. When they finished, he set down the papers and looked at her. You've done excellent work, Marigold. The building is profitable, the tenants are happy, you've managed everything beautifully. Thank you. I'm buying another property. Bigger this time, 30 units. I want you to manage it as well, with a salary increase to match the additional responsibility. She should have been excited. Instead, she felt a flutter of nerves. Cassius, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you doing this? Really, all of it? He leaned back in his chair, that familiar gesture that meant he was considering his words carefully. I told you before. I know what you told me before. But that was 2 years ago. You helped me escape an abusive situation, helped me get custody of my children, gave me a job I'm good at. You've done enough, more than enough. So why keep doing more? Because you keep proving yourself worthy of more. He said it simply, like it was obvious. Because every time I give you an opportunity, you exceed my expectations. Because you've gone from a desperate woman stealing money to survive, to a successful property manager who's changed the lives of dozens of families. That's not my doing, Marigold. That's you. I just opened the doors. You walked through them. But you keep opening doors. Yes? Why? He stood up and moved to the window, his back to her, silent for a long moment. Outside, the gardens were in full bloom, flowers he barely noticed because he was too busy thinking about the woman behind him, about how much his life had changed since the night he'd caught her stealing. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. Dana, do you know what haunts me most about my past? It's not the violence or the illegal activities, or the moral compromises. It's the people I couldn't save. The ones who needed help, who deserved help, who I turned away from because I was too focused on my own survival, too afraid of what helping them might cost me. He turned to face her. I have power now. Real power. And I can use it to help people like you. People who are strong and capable, but trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Every time I do that, every time I see someone like you succeed and thrive, it feels like redemption. Like maybe all the terrible things I did to get here meant something. Like maybe I can balance the scales, at least a little bit. Marigold stood up, moved to stand beside him at the window. You're a good man, Cassius Levine. I'm not. But I'm trying to be better. That's what makes you good. They stood there together, looking out at the gardens, the comfortable silence between them that came from years of knowing each other, trusting each other, supporting each other. What neither of them said, what both of them felt, was that this had become more than a professional relationship, more than a business arrangement. Somewhere along the way, they'd become important to each other, not romantically. There were too many boundaries, too much history, too much complexity for that, but something deeper than friendship, something that felt like family. I'll take the new property, Marigold finally said. On one condition. What's that? You stop acting like you're doing me favors. This is a business arrangement. I'm good at my job. You need someone good at this job. And we're partners in this, not savior and victim. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Partners. I can agree to that. They shook hands on it, formal and professional, and Marigold felt the shift between them. Not employer and employee, not savior and victim. Partners, equals. Two people who'd helped each other become better versions of themselves. Life continued. The children grew. Celine started middle school and joined the drama club, displaying a theatrical flair that made Marigold both proud and slightly concerned. Jasper discovered a talent for soccer and spent every weekend at games, his earlier shyness melting away on the field. Marigold managed 2 properties, then 3, then 4, building a reputation in the industry, earning the respect of contractors and tenants and other property managers. These people who'd initially been skeptical of someone without formal training quickly learned that she had something more valuable, genuine care for the people who lived in her buildings, combined with the organizational skills of someone who'd learned to stretch every dollar. Garrick faded into the background of their lives. He completed his court-mandated programs and had supervised visits with the kids once a month. They were awkward at first, but eventually settled into a routine. He wasn't a good father, but he was trying to be less of a bad one, and Marigold supposed that was something. The debt collectors Cassius had paid off continued to pressure Garrick for the remainder of what he owed, which kept him too busy and too scared to cause problems for his ex-wife. Cassius and Marigold maintained their professional relationship. But it had evolved into something that felt almost like friendship. They had coffee sometimes, discussed business and life and everything in between. He came to Celine's school plays and Jasper's soccer games, sitting in the back, clapping politely, never making a fuss about his presence. "You don't have to do this," Marigold told him once, after watching him sit through a particularly painful middle school production of Romeo and Juliet. "They're not your responsibility." "I know," he said, "but I want to. Is that okay?" And it was. It was more than okay. 5 years after that morning when her life changed, Marigold stood in the same mansion kitchen where Cassius had first offered her help, where they'd had that crucial conversation that set everything in motion. But now she wasn't wearing a maid's uniform. She was in business clothes, holding a tablet with reports for their monthly meeting. "The West Avenue property is ready for occupancy," she reported. "Full renovation complete, 12 units, all passed inspection. We have applications for all of them already." "Excellent." He reviewed the numbers she'd sent him. "And the Henderson building. Maintenance schedule is on track. 2 tenants moving out next month, but we have a waiting list. I'm recommending we upgrade the laundry facilities. The current machines are 10 years old and starting to have problems." They went through the rest of the properties, discussing budgets and timelines and strategies. Professional, efficient, successful. When they finished, he poured them both coffee, a ritual they'd developed over the years, and they sat at the kitchen table like old friends. "Celine's graduation is next week," Marigold mentioned. "She's valedictorian." "I know. She told me when I saw her last weekend." "You don't have to come to everything. I appreciate it, but I want to be there." He said it firmly. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay. The kids love having you there. They ask about you constantly. They're good kids. You've done an amazing job with them." Marigold smiled, thinking about her chaotic, beautiful children. About how far they'd all come from that terrified woman, stealing money in the night. About the life they'd built together, the three of them, and Cassius, always there in the background, never intrusive, but always supportive. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "Yes, you could have. You're stronger than you know, Marigold. You always were. I just helped you see it." "Maybe, but I'm still grateful. For everything. For taking a chance on me when you had every reason not to. For seeing potential in someone who'd given up on herself. For being who you are." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. A gesture that would have been impossible 5 years ago, when walls surrounded every part of him. But Marigold had changed that, had changed him, simply by trusting him enough to accept help. "Thank you," he said. "For trusting me. For letting me help. For becoming my partner instead of just my employee. For showing me that redemption is possible, even for people like me." They sat there in the sunshine streaming through the kitchen windows, two people who'd saved each other in different ways. Who'd built something meaningful from desperate circumstances. Who'd proven that sometimes the right kind of help, offered at the right time, could change everything. Celine's graduation was beautiful. She gave a speech about resilience and hope and never giving up, even when things seem impossible. Words that made Marigold cry because she knew exactly where they came from, knew that her daughter had learned them by watching her mother survive. Marigold sat in the audience with Jasper beside her and Cassius on her other side, and she cried like every proud mother does. Afterward, during the reception, Celine ran up to them with her diploma in hand and threw her arms around Cassius. "Thank you for coming," she said, her face bright with joy. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied, returning the hug carefully. "Hey, I'm very proud of you. You're like an uncle," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Is that weird? I know you're mom's boss, but you feel like family." He glanced at Marigold, something soft and uncertain in his eyes. She nodded, giving him permission to answer honestly. "Not weird at all," he said to Celine. "I feel the same way." Later, after the kids had gone off to celebrate with their friends and Marigold was helping Cassius carry gifts to the car, he paused. "Was that okay? What I said to Celine? It was perfect, Because it's true, isn't it? You are family. Maybe not by blood, but by choice, by everything we've been through together. Family, he repeated, testing the word. In his world, family was usually code for obligation, for manipulation, for the ties that bound you to people who used you. But this felt different. This felt real. Good, because you're stuck with us now. He laughed, a real laugh, not the polite chuckle he used in business meetings, but the genuine sound of joy. I can think of worse fates. That night, after everyone had left and the children were asleep, in the house that Marigold now owned, bought with a down payment she'd saved herself from her salary, she sat on her back porch with a cup of tea and looked up at the stars. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a desperate woman stealing money to survive, to a successful businesswoman with a beautiful home and thriving children. She thought about Cassius and his quiet power, his strategic mind, his unexpected compassion, about how he'd seen her at her absolute worst, and instead of condemnation, he'd offered redemption. And she thought about the woman she used to be, terrified, trapped, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, independent, capable of building a life worth living. The transformation hadn't been instant. It had taken years of hard work, countless small steps, moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But she'd made it. They'd made it. Her and Celine and Jasper, with Cassius's steady support guiding them through the darkness. Her phone buzzed, a text from Cassius. "Thank you for including me today. It meant more than you know." She typed back, "Thank you for everything, for seeing me, for believing in me, for being family. Always." One word, but it carried the weight of promises kept, of lives changed, of redemption earned and freely given. Across the city, in his mansion that felt emptier than usual, Cassius sat in his office and looked at that single word he'd sent. Always. He'd meant it. Somewhere along the way, this woman and her children had become the most important people in his life. Not in a romantic way. There were too many complications, too much history, too much power imbalance for that. But in a way that mattered more. They'd become his reason for being better. His proof that he could use his power for something good. His redemption. He thought about his mother, who died protecting him, about the man who'd saved him, who died 5 years later, never knowing how much that simple act of kindness had mattered, about all the years he'd spent building his empire, convinced that power was the only thing that mattered, that compassion was weakness, and that helping others was a luxury he couldn't afford. And then he thought about Marigold, trembling in his office with stolen money in her hands, about the decision he'd made that night to follow her, to understand, to help. That decision had changed everything. It had given him purpose beyond profit. It had shown him that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but about small choices made consistently. About opening doors for people and letting them walk through on their own power. About using strength to protect rather than dominate. He'd saved Marigold, but in doing so, she'd saved him too. Cassius stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens lit by moonlight. Somewhere out there, Marigold was sitting on her porch, maybe thinking about him, maybe not. And her children were sleeping safely in their beds. She had a job she was good at, a home she owned, a future full of possibility. And he'd been part of making that happen. For the first time in 20 years, Cassius Levine felt something close to peace. Not the absence of problems. He still had a criminal empire to manage, enemies to outmaneuver, the weight of terrible decisions that could never be undone. But the constant, gnawing emptiness that had defined his existence for so long had been replaced by something else. Purpose, connection. The knowledge that at least one person in this world was better off because he'd made the choice to help instead of hurt. It was enough, more than enough. Cassius finished his drink and headed upstairs. Tomorrow there would be business to attend to, problems to solve, and the usual complications of his life. But tonight, he could sleep knowing that he'd done at least one thing right. He'd caught a woman stealing, and instead of punishment, he'd offered her hope, and that hope had grown into something beautiful, something that transcended the transaction that started it all, something that proved that even people who'd done terrible things could still choose to do good. In her house, Marigold locked the doors, not to keep danger out, because the danger was gone, but simply because it was nighttime, and that's what you did. Normal. Safe. Home. The lights went out one by one as she moved through her house, and in the darkness, she smiled. You're not alone anymore. Neither of them would ever be alone again. They'd found in each other something rare and precious, not romance, not dependence, but genuine partnership. Two people who'd been broken in different ways, who'd helped each other heal, who'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely connections become the most meaningful. She wasn't stealing for herself, she was buying time. But time had given her something she never expected, not just survival, but a life worth living, not just escape, but transformation, not just safety, but joy. And that, she thought as she checked on her sleeping children one last time,